Hi everyone, this is Damien Linnane, and welcome to my video with advice on how to get published. You know, a lot of people reach out to me asking for advice on how to get published, and I used to really enjoy meeting those people like one-on-one over Zoom, giving advice, but it's just gotten to the point where too many people are asking, which is a good thing, but I just don't have the time, so I thought I'd record this video, which will hopefully reach a few more people as well. If you're watching this video, you're probably well aware I'm a published author. So I've written two books, Scarred, crime thriller, which came out in 2019, picked up by a tiny publisher, and then also Raw, memoir, which was published by a small but much more established publisher in 2024. And as you can see, I still have the mohawk, so still got that rocking. But anyway, so I have two published books, but I'm not a best-selling author. So feel free to take my advice with a grain of salt. I can only tell you what worked for me and what didn't work for me. I'm not going to give heaps of advice on how to write. I feel like that's a different subject, but I will say this, and that is pick a book that gives you advice on how to write, and I would recommend On Writing by Stephen King. That was the book I read that told me everything I needed to know. After I read that, I didn't feel like I had to go out and find more information. Everything I needed to know was in there. But I will reiterate a couple of things from that book. And the first one is, because probably the most common question I get is how did you manage to write your novel in 5 months? My first draft came out in 5 months. And the answer to that was just consistency. I wrote every day, and not for 8 hours a day. Don't do that. That's exhausting. I set myself a goal of writing like 1 to 2,000 words every day. And, that old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. If you do a little bit each day, you'll be amazed at how quickly you eventually get done. Now, if 1 to 2,000 words sounds too daunting, just drop it down to 500 or just pick a couple of days a week. Just schedule something in, like Tuesdays, Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m. This is when I write. You got to pick some time, schedule it in. Otherwise, one day you're going to realize you're one of those people that's been writing a book for 10, 20 years. If you don't actively make time to get it done, it's not going to happen. So I really recommend writing every day. That's what works for me. Other pieces of advice I would give is write your whole book, your first draft rather, before you ask for any advice. So I think it's really important to get all your creative process out before you start asking for advice and having people throw you off on tangents and things like that. And the last thing I'll say there is make sure you take a break after you finish your draft. So I wrote my first draft, 5 months, put it aside. I think I put it aside for 1 or 2 months even maybe. And that's really important because you need to take a break and then come back at it with a fresh set of eyes, 1 or 2 months later. And so I did that. I worked on the second draft. Spent a few weeks on that. Did some rewrites, and basically I kept repeating this process. Then took a break. Worked on draft 3, draft 4. I think I got to draft 5, and by the time I got to draft 5, I got to a point where I was like, okay, I have improved this draft as much as I can on my own. Now I need external help if it wants to get better. And here's my first advice for how to refine a book to get it published, and that is hire a manuscript assessor. I cannot stress that enough. If you don't know what a manuscript assessor is, basically this is a person whose job is to read an unpublished manuscript and write a 2 to 3 page report on all its strengths and weaknesses and what should be changed. You're looking at about $600 for a manuscript assessment, and my first one I got was the best money I ever spent on a book. So, put things in perspective, I've sent this draft of my crime thriller Scarred, and the feedback in the report was, there was a lot of feedback, but the main thing they said was, you can read the first 2 chapters of Scarred for free from my website, and if you read the first chapter, I won't go into too much detail, but basically, the ending of that first chapter comes as a really big surprise, and then after that chapter in the first draft, I explained the main character's childhood in about 4 or 5 chapters to explain why he became that way and why that ending of that chapter, which really comes out of nowhere, occurred. I sent it for a manuscript assessment, and the assessor said, Damien, no, don't do it like this. Don't give that much backstory all at once after you've given an introductory chapter. What you need to do is you either need to shift the start of your novel earlier so that you start it from his childhood, or present his childhood as a series of flashbacks over the course of the novel. And as soon as I read that, I was like, oh my God, you're right. That's way better. And that's what I did. I went with the latter option. I presented my main character's childhood in a series of flashbacks, and that was made my novel so much better. And I never would have come up with that idea for myself by myself. So that was one of the things the manuscript assessment did. Once you've got a manuscript assessment, consider getting an editor, and consider getting an editor. It has to be after the manuscript assessment. That's because, you're going to get your assessment, you're going to do some rewrites, hopefully, and after that, what an editor does is they will go through your draft like line by line, tweak the prose, improve things. They'll make some suggestions and fix typos as well, but they're basically cleaning up the prose, and you don't want to do that and then get a manuscript assessment because, the manuscript assessor might tell you to change things. Well, they probably will, and then you do rewrites. And if you've already paid for an editor before that, then obviously a lot of those rewrites are going to get lost, and so a lot of your money is going to be wasted. I would say a manuscript assessment is mandatory, or it should be at least. The thing with an editor is it's very expensive. You're probably looking at $2,000 minimum. I believe mine was more like 2.5. It's going to depend on the word count. And especially if you're self-publishing, you need to be aware that more likely than not, statistically, you won't make that money back. So if you don't get an editor, I think that's understandable. If you don't get a manuscript assessment, if you don't have a spare $600 to help improve your manuscript, my opinion is you're wasting your time. You need to at least get some feedback. I approached my novel on the belief that I was not going to make my money back. At the time, I thought this might be the only thing I ever publish, and because of that, I wanted to refine it as much as possible and have it as polished, and because this is part of my legacy. And so I went into that on the belief that I wasn't going to break even. Now, thankfully, not only did I break even, I eventually turned a decent profit because of how much I promoted the book. But, if you're writing to make a profit, you're probably doing it wrong. For every Stephen King out there, there's 20,000 people like you or me who, even if we write a book that's well received, we're not going to get rich off it. So, if you don't think it's worth getting an editor, I think that's understandable. That being said, especially with self-published books, I would say 3/4 of the self-published books I read, I'm reading it and I was like, geez, this really could have used some cleaning up. The prose is long-winded, you probably could have cut several thousand words out of this. The first draft, or rather the last draft before I got an editor of my novel was 91,000 words. And the editor cut that back to 86,000, and not by deleting mass chunks and chapters of my novel, just by cleaning up the prose, taking a couple words out of every second sentence, basically. A big skill as a writer is learning how to say as much as possible with as few words as possible, and that's something an editor really helps you with. So after that really cleaned up the draft a lot, and I couldn't really have been happier with that. If you get an editor, or if you're skipping that stage, something that I would consider mandatory after that is proofreading. You could hire a copy editor, like a professional who does that. So the editor will fix any typos they see, but proofreading isn't their job. Their job is cleaning up the prose and giving you some feedback. A dedicated copy editor would go through and look for typos and grammar issues, but I don't really think you need to go to that expense. I would just ask. Well, what I did was I got several friends to proofread it for me. Sometimes people say like, "Oh, why didn't you just use spell check?" And I'm like, "Well, I did." And spell check is notoriously not perfect. Um, it doesn't pick up everything. It makes mistakes, and it has a really hard time, picking up things that are technically typos but are still a word. Like if you accidentally write faux instead of for example. So with my novel, I proofread it myself a few times, and here's some advice for proofreading. Um, it's difficult to find your own typos, which is why you need to get friends to do it, because your brain knows what you meant to write, and so it's going to automatically fill in the gaps for you. And so, like, a couple of tips if you're just doing it yourself is to get your manuscript and just select all and change the font. Change the font to something radically different to what you spent months writing, and that's going to help. Something else that helps is reading out loud. That then you really start to see a lot more typos if you read out loud. And another thing is to not read in chronological order. So read your book backwards. Read the last chapter first, and then go back. Those are some things you can do yourself. I did all of that, and then I gave my novel to two friends to proofread before I got published, and both of those friends found three typos each, but it was a completely different three typos. And after that, I was like, well, I looks like there's some more typos in there, and everybody finds something different. And so I got those two friends to read it. Then I proofreaded it myself a few times, and then when it went out, and there was still some typos in there. It's hard to find them all. And so after realizing that with my first book, with my second book, I actually got 10 friends to proofread it. And once I got 10 friends to do that, everyone found something different. And to the best of my knowledge, there's only one typo that was left in the first edition, and that's since been fixed. So the more friends you get to proofread it, the better. Friends are probably going to be very willing to do that, especially with my second book. People who liked my first book, when I offered them the chance of sneak peek at the second one, people jumped at that. So they were very happy to do that, and I can't recommend that enough. I think you can save money from a professional copy editor and get some friends to do it, but get several friends to do it and tell them to mark as much as possible. Some of my friends were like, "Oh, I don't know if I wanted to upset you." I'm like, no. The more red you write on this book with things like typos and like even things that aren't clear. Like, for example, I told people, like, if anything's not clear, please point that out. And, for example, in my novel, at one point, I used the term, my main character used a combine dressing. And, I used to be an army medic, so I know what that is. And one of my proofreaders said, "What the hell is a combine dressing?" And I was like, that's a good point. Some people wouldn't know that, so I just simplified it and said, you put a bandage on it. So ask your friends to just clarify anything that's not clear at all. I made a really huge mistake when I tried to get published, and that was that I sent early drafts of my my manuscript to publishers on the grounds that I was thinking, maybe they're really going to love this, and then they'll offer to edit it for me, and wouldn't that save me some money? Fun fact, that was a really tall order, and it didn't happen. So publishers get lots of manuscripts all the time, and it's a very competitive market, and you want to stand out from the crowd a bit. So you want to polish your memoir, I keep saying memoir, your manuscript as much as possible, because you need to make a good impression. And one of the reasons you need to do that is something I didn't know, is that a publisher will never look at a manuscript a second time, no matter how much you refine it. So, Penguin, the top 5 publishers, if they reject you once, they will never look at that manuscript again. They're busy. They're going to look at it. This guy. Oh no, we already read that. No, we already said no to that. Don't waste our time. So you've only got one shot with each publisher, and I didn't know that. So I sent early drafts to the top 5 publishers, got rejected by all of them, and then didn't realize that they would never look at that again. I would recommend you try and find an agent before you try and submit to publishers. So publishers, it's called unsolicited manuscripts when you don't have an agent and you send it to a publisher yourself. Some publishers accept that all the time. Some don't. Some only accept unsolicited manuscripts on certain days, and some don't accept them at all. Now, if you find an agent, that gives you a huge step up to a publisher, because a publisher knows that an agent wouldn't have taken you on unless your work was good quality, and so they're going to give your work a lot more consideration and a lot more credence if you have an agent. Now, I double shafted myself by I sent it to publishers myself, got rejected, and then I decided to start trying to find an agent. And I should have done it the other way around, because I found out the hard way that a lot of agents wouldn't consider taking me on if I'd already been rejected by several publishers. Like, it was even in the online form for one of them, like, have you been rejected by more than 3 publishers? If so, sorry, we're not going to take your manuscript. And so, I excluded myself from several agents because I'd already submitted it to publishers. And I did actually find one agent who was really interested in my manuscript, and he actually asked to call me. And he said, Damien, I'm on the fence with this. What are your plans for writing? Are you planning on turning this into a series? Because I think it's really good. And I said to him, at the time I was doing a master's degree. I was really busy, and I didn't have an idea for a second book at the time. And I told him, look, my priority right now is finishing my postgraduate studies. I don't have any plans to write. And he said, well, Damien, I was on the fence about this, and if you're not going to turn it into a series, I'm going to say no, because there's not a lot of money to be made from one book. And that's completely true. The rule of thumb is once you get about 4 or 5 books out, you can actually start to make some decent money. But it's almost impossible these days to make a career, a full-time career just out of writing as your primary source of income. So he was completely right. It wasn't going to be worth his time to take that on. The point I'm making is that you can write a very good book, and an agent might not take it on for several reasons, including you're not turning into a series, and a publisher might not take it on for several reasons as well. If you're sending unsolicited manuscripts to publishers yourself, there's a very high chance they won't even read it. Penguin might just look at it. They're like, Damien Linnane, he's an unpublished author, never heard of him. What's he written, a crime thriller? We've published a lot of those recently. We're not in the market for that right now. No. And they reject your manuscript without even reading it. It's important to know this. If you don't handle rejection well, submitting to publishers and agents is probably not for you. You're better off self-publishing. So, so publishers might not even read your manuscript, and most of them don't give personalized feedback, because that's just too much effort, considering how many manuscripts they get. So I actually, I kept refining my manuscript. I got to draft 5. That's when I hired a manuscript assessor. Then I submitted to a couple more publishers. I still wasn't getting picked up. At that point, I decided to. I actually got a second manuscript assessment. That's not too abnormal. Feel free to get 2. I'll put the links to the 2 manuscript assessment services I used in the comments. I don't get any commission from those. Basically, I'm just telling you who I used because I recommend both. That being said, I don't have any experience with any others, so they might all be good, but those are the ones I used. I got a second manuscript assessment. The feedback was really, really good again. It's kind of funny. My first manuscript assessor, they said, Damien, the detective in your novel is very two-dimensional. You need to flesh that person out more. And I said, okay. And I fleshed that person out. And then I got a second manuscript assessor, and they said the exact same thing. And I'm like, well, they must really be onto something, because I fleshed it out. Well, I thought I did, and it wasn't enough. And so that was really good to hear. And then I submitted it to another publisher, didn't get picked up, and at that point I decided to bite the bullet and hire an editor, even though that was very expensive. And by this stage, I probably only had about 2. I had only had 2 publishers left who were accepting unsolicited manuscripts. I sent it to both of them, and at this point I started looking into self-publishing, because I thought I'd have to do that by default if I got rejected by everyone. One of those final two publishers picked me up. Now, they were a really, really tiny publisher. Basically, I went through order of preference of publishers I wanted, and by the end, I was looking at really tiny publishers, and they were very upfront. They were like, we don't have the funding to promote this book much. We're not going to organize tours. We're not going to, get you on the radio. We're going to basically put our stamp on this, which is going to give your book some credence, which it did. Like I said, like if you have an agent, publishers will take your book more seriously. And if you have a publisher, bookstores and people will take you more seriously. If I could take my time again, I don't regret going with a really tiny publisher, but if I could have my time over, I probably would have just self-published, possibly just to see what was different. But the reason I would have self-published is because my tiny publisher was so small, they actually couldn't get my book into stores on shelves. My second book that came out, my memoir, that the publisher, bigger publisher, distributed by Simon and Schuster. So my book was on shelves, but my first book, my novel, was not. I had to take it into into bookstores myself and sell it on consignment. Now, I'm of the opinion that if your publisher can't get you on shelves, what's the point? You may as well just self-publish, and the reason for that is, if you self-publish, your cut from sales is much, much higher. With a regular publisher, you're looking at $1, $2 tops. The royalties are dismal. Now, granted, you will sell more copies. I'll give you an example of how. So, my first book wasn't on shelves. If bookstores sold it, I had to take it into them physically and give it to them on consignment. Now, what that means is they don't buy the book off me. They agree to take the book off me. They put it on shelves, and if it sells, they will give me my cut after they take their own. The cut's dismal. But that people did take my book on, and part of the reason they took it on was because they looked at my book and they were like, "Oh, you found a publisher. Yeah, we'll take this on." Some of my friends self-published, went into those exact same stores, and they were told no. And the only thing we can put that down to is the fact that they self-published. Self-publishing will always have a stigma with it. It shouldn't, but it does. And the reason it's always going to have a stigma is anyone can publish anything, no matter how unrefined it is. Like I said, like 3/4 of the self-published books I read really could have been, tidied up, polished a lot more. And, bookstores know this. And so if you have a publisher, it gives you a lot more weight. It also got me some more speaking experiences. I'll talk about library talks more later. But for example, I applied to give a library talk. I sent them this library an email, and when I actually turned up to do the talk, they actually said to me, Damien, we get emails from authors all the time. We were going to trash your email, but then we noticed that both your books had publishers, and we're like, oh, this guy isn't self-published, we'll give him a go. And then they looked into me and they're like, oh, this guy's got some publicity, we'll give him a talk. So having a publisher does open doors, but I would have made more money from my first book if I just had a self-published, because even though I got more sales because I had a publisher, the cut was like $1.50 per sale. When you go the self-publishing route, your cut's a lot higher. So even though you'll sell like maybe 1/4 of the books, you'll actually earn more. So it depends what your values are and what you want. But I would, like I said, if your publisher can't get you on shelves, I don't really see the point in doing that. Here's the thing though, if you self-publish, and I cannot stress this enough, you need to hire a good cover artist. That turf asterism, don't judge a book by its cover. Fun fact, everyone's going to judge your book by its cover. So make sure you get a good cover artist. I'd say the two things that you absolutely have to spend money on when publishing is a manuscript assessment, and if you're self-publishing, a cover artist. And to be honest, if you only have enough money for one of those, If you don't actually mind how well your book's received and you just want it to sell copies, I would go with the cover artist because, if you get a manuscript assessment, the book's going to be better quality. But if you get a really crappy cover, very few people are going to buy it. I actually had a friend say to me once, like, bragging to me, she's like, Damien, check it out. This cover only cost me $20. And I didn't say this to her, but like, I was like, yeah, it kind of looks like it cost $20 and I wouldn't buy this book because of that. So if people are going to judge your book by its cover, and it's also important that your cover reflects what's in the book. Another person showed me their book cover, and the book cover itself looked good, but it wasn't really relevant to their story. Now, I don't want to out that person, but I knew what their story was about. It was actually quite heavy, and their book cover was a really beautiful picture of like a dirt road and just like traveling into the distance. The theme they were trying to go for with that cover was like my journey. But as I said to them, and they changed it thankfully after I gave them this feedback, I said, look, mate, this is really ambiguous. You look at this cover, you're like, well, what's this book about? Is it going to be about a retiree going on an open road, caravan journey? Because that's the vibe I'm getting. Scarred. Sorry, the lighting here isn't fantastic, but you can see there's a guy holding a gun on a cover, and you can't see it very well, but like over here is Centrepoint Tower in the backwards, so you can tell it's a crime book, and it's set in like a city, and it's set in Sydney, if you know what Sydney looks like. Now, this cover's quite generic, to be honest. Like, no one's going to look at this and be like, oh man, that's a killer cover. It's quite generic, but it's competent. It conveys, it looks decent, and it conveys, what the book's going to be about. So, I can't stress that enough. It's really important to get a good cover artist if you're self-publishing and you want your book to sell. Getting into consignments. So as I mentioned, I took my book into stores. I live in Newcastle. I took my book to every bookstore in town. All of them said yes, they take it on consignment except one, and that was a big chain of books who said they only sell books from the top 5 publishers. The other 5 took it on consignment, but like I said, the cut was dismal, like what I got. In fact, I took my spruiking my book at one store. This store said they'd take 3 copies and see how it went. They called me a couple of months later and said, Damien, all 3 copies sold. Can we have some more? And that bookstore was about 40 minutes from my house and on walk, and I didn't have a car at the time. And I was like, oh, I should get the bus in. And then it occurred to me, my cut was about $1.40 per sale. So if I got the bus there and back, it would literally be more, I would literally lose money taking my book there. I didn't take my book into these stores to make money. I took it in there to get the word out that my book existed. People, sometimes I'd give author talks and people be like, oh, I've seen that book around, and it actually does help just having your book on shelves. Like, people see it and they remember it. Yeah, so that helps. But I mean, taking your book in consignment, it's a love of the job thing. You're not going to get rich. Other ways I'd recommend promoting your book. So something I don't recommend is advertising. Or don't take out an ad in the paper that just has a picture of your book, awesome new crime thriller in the style of whoever, available now. You will never ever make your money back. And the reason for that is people aren't going to buy your book, or very few people are going to buy your book unless they feel a personal connection with you. And how they get that is by reading an interview, or hearing an interview, or hearing a podcast, or hearing an author talk, and hearing your story. That's what's going to sell your book. Something else I want to mention is do not pay for reviews. First of all, it's really unethical. It really undermines your credibility as an author if you're paying for reviews. And also, again, you're never going to make your money back. So something that happens to me to this day is, and as soon as you publish your book, if you have a website or if you're on social media, you are going to start getting inundated with messages from professional book reviewers. Hey, I loved your book. I would love to feature it on my profile. This person didn't love your book. That's an automated message. And once you message them, inquiring about how to get your book on their profile, they're going to drop the bomb that, it's going to cost you $50. And, some of these accounts look decent. They've got, tens of thousands of followers, but most of the followers are bots. The posts have like 1,000 likes each, but those are, again, probably bot likes. And even if they're not, you will never make your money back. If you took out an ad in your local paper, it's probably going to cost you a couple $100. Especially if you found a publisher, like I said, couple dollars per sale. I would be amazed if somebody saw an impersonal ad for your book, and if a impersonal ad went out and you sold more than 5 copies. I actually wrote a blog post on my website about going into depth more about why you shouldn't pay for reviews. I'll put a link to that in the comments as well. And I'm going to put a link as well to a site that actually does reviews for free in exchange for digital copies of your book. So I don't get any commission from them, and this is just someone I recommend. Basically, people sign up to this website, and in exchange for a free digital copy of your book, they will offer you a review. Don't pay for reviews because A, you don't have to. You can get people to do it for free. And B, it's really unethical. Like I said, people will buy your book or have a much larger chance of doing that if they feel a personal connection with you. And so one of the ways to do that is with doing library talks, or interviews in general. I want to start with libraries. First things first. Not a lot of people know this, but the Australian government has a public lending rights scheme, and what that means is, sometimes people say like, oh, isn't it bad if the library orders your book, then people are borrowing it instead of buying it? Like, no, the Australian government has a scheme where every time someone borrows your book, you get a very small royalty, and that kind of offsets the fact that less people are buying your book because they're borrowing it instead. However, you need to register for this. You need to go to the website. I'll put a link in the comments, and you need to register this yourself. It isn't automatic. With my first book, I didn't actually know this existed, and I missed out on a couple of years of royalties. Wasn't a fortune, but I missed out on some money. So when my second book came out, once I had the ISBN and the International Standard Book Number and the publishing date, I actually went and pre-registered it on this site before it was actually in stores, so I knew I wouldn't miss out at all. One way, it's something that's very effective is if, tell your friends to go to their local library and request that the library buy a copy. They probably will. They don't get heaps of requests like that. And so if you go to the trouble to do that, they'll probably buy it for the library. And that's a source of revenue for you. Before you ask your friends to do that and especially if you self-publish, you need to register your book with library suppliers. Not many people know this, but libraries do not buy their books from bookstores, and they definitely don't buy them directly from you or the general public. They order their books from library suppliers. Now, this is a type of company that exclusively sells books to libraries. There's a lot of libraries out there, and libraries get their books from these suppliers. There's a few of them. They're like bookstores in the sense that there's a few in competition with each other. Now, for my first book, I found that very tiny publisher, and they registered me with the main library supplier. So I called them and I said, just wanted to check my books on your database so that libraries can order it. And they said, yes, it is. And then I called the next one and I said the same thing. And they said, no, we don't have your book on our catalogue. Fun fact, I have the ISBN of my first book tattooed on my arm. And, I called this library supplier and they said, we don't have your book on our catalogue. Would you like us to add it on? And I said, yes, I'd really love that. And they said, do you have your ISBN on you? And I said, you know what? As a matter of fact, I actually do. But anyway, so, thankfully with my second book, much bigger publisher, and I was already on there. I called to check, even though I was 99% sure to be on there. But yeah, if you self-publish in particular, your book will not be automatically added onto there. Call the library suppliers and make sure it's just on their catalogue. Because they don't have a problem with putting it on. They don't actively hunt for every self-published book that came out. So you need to call them. That's one way to get the word out. And feel free to go into your library and ask if you can do an author talk. I have done many. Another fun fact, I was supposed to give my first ever author talk at the Newcastle Writers Festival in 2020. I was so excited. It was going to be my first ever author talk. And 3 days before the festival opened, we went into COVID lockdown. And so one thing I did was I was like, well, this sucks, but I've got some free time now. How should I promote my book now that we're not doing live talks? And so something I did is I sent an email to every library in Australia that I could find an email address for, and I sent them the same email. I'm like, hey, this is who I am. This is my story. This is my book. Would you consider buying it? And I'm also available for author talks. And obviously most of those emails were ignored. A couple dozen libraries wrote back and said, oh, thanks for your email, sounds interesting. We've ordered a copy of your book. And at least 5 libraries actually emailed me back and said, actually, we'd love to do an online author interview, or we'd love you to record a video for us and we'll share that on our website, because libraries still wanted to stay connected with the community, and so they switched to doing like online interviews, and that was a really great way for me to get the word out. If you go into your library, it's better if you do it in person, obviously. If you go into your local library and say, I'm a local author, I'd like to do a talk, they'll probably be quite open to it. My day job takes me around the country a bit, and if I'm going to Adelaide or Brisbane or somewhere, often I'll try and email libraries in advance and try to line up an author talk, while I'm in the neighborhood. Libraries are great for helping promote books. They love it. Another thing I did, I sent emails to a lot of book podcasts, saying, hey, I'm available for interviews. A lot of them took me up on that. Something I didn't really go into much in this was how to write individual books, how to write a crime novel, how to write a memoir. And the reason for that is, I didn't want to get too sidetracked, but also I've done some podcast interviews specifically about that. I'll put the links to that below. I will say a couple of things, there's no right or wrong way to write a book. Some people with a novel, plan everything out in advance and then fill in the chapters one by one. I didn't do that. I didn't know how my novel was going to go at any point, and I couldn't wait to start writing every day to find out what happened next. I had no idea where it was going. It wrote itself, basically. That's how I wrote my novel. How I wrote my memoir is, and I knew this was going to be way too long, but I decided to write my life out in chronological order. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then I decided that once that was finished, I would look over it again, refine it, decide what was important and what I wanted to keep and where the themes were and how I would focus on them. And put things in perspective, my first draft of my memoir was 160-something thousand words. The published version was 83. So I cut a lot out of it. Are those the best ways to write a novel or a memoir? I don't know, but they really worked for me, so I would recommend that for me. But didn't want to get too much into how to write a book too much, because I've covered that before and don't want to get sidetracked. But that was the main ways I promoted my book. I also reached out to local media. Just even for my first book, I got a full-page review in the regional newspaper. 3 smaller newsletters published it as well. Reach out to people. The worst thing they can say is no, especially the smaller a newsletter is, the more likely they'll take it on, because they're looking for things to print. Thankfully with my second book, I got some reviews that weren't really solicited, which was really great. I reached out to local radio. Local radio interviewed me as well. And like I said, a lot of podcasts. And one thing I would recommend, that is, if you're going to do podcast interviews, invest in a microphone. It makes a difference. When you're listening to a podcast or a radio interview and the person's talking on their phone and the quality is just not that good. It'll make things a lot more listenable if you get a microphone. But anyway, that's about all I wanted to touch on today. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and hopefully I'll get to them when I can. I'll put some links to my books as well. If you want to check those out, you're very welcome to. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, please take the 1 second it takes to click the like button. Hopefully that'll boost the algorithm and send this this video to a few more people, and give some good tips about writing. But thanks for listening, and see you next time.